Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, The Development of the Unified Standards System, an update on progress. Today's presentation will be recorded and will be posted on the Hub. In addition, an email will be sent to all registered participants with links to the recording and presentation. There are several of you joining us today, and we're so excited to have you. To make sure that we capture all the questions, we encourage you to type your questions into the question box on the webinar doc. Now, on to Laura with Textile Exchange. Laura?
Thank you, Rose. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our update on the Unified Standard. It has been a bit of time since we've given new information to the broader community about what we've been doing with the development of the standard. I believe the last time that we really talked about this in a broader public way was at the conference we had in November in Colorado. And then before that, we had an update to what we were doing last summer. I know a lot of people have had that presentation kind of in their queue and have heard it. Some of that information will be a repeat here just to make sure that everybody is on the same page as we move into some of the key details of what we're doing this year and what's coming next. And with that, I want to show that who we are today that you're going to be hearing from. So myself, I am Laura Kohler and running the standards and assurance team at Textile Exchange with the core focus because of the major initiative we have, the Unified Standard. That's been a big part of my focus for the past year. And then also you'll be hearing from Trini Gantner, who is head of our standards development. So she's on the day-to-day oversight and management of how we're pulling this new standard system together. And also you will hear from Callie Weldon, who is our externally facing engagement manager. So probably many of you have had some form of dialogue exchange with Callie. And for the agenda, so I will give a bit of background on who we are organizationally and then more specifically what we're doing in standards and assurance. Then I will walk us through the Unified Standard System, make sure that everybody is on the same page in terms of what is this system, what are we doing, what are our goals and objectives with moving towards a new standard. And how we're using the pivot in standards to drive outcomes. So I'll be going through then content and then handing over to Trini to give some of the relevant updates for where we are today, what you're going to be seeing over the next few weeks. And then Callie will let everybody know how you can participate, what to be on the lookout for in terms of information coming your way and how you can engage with us on that. And then we will have a Q&A at the end. So as I understand, what's going to be important for you is as you're thinking about questions, when they come to mind, you can put it in the Q&A box. And then Callie is going to help organize that information on the back end so that we can answer those questions at the end. So about Textile Exchange, I'd like to start with our mission because it directly relates to what we're doing with the Unified Standard System. Organizationally, we are set up to inspire and equip people and accelerate and organizations as they move towards adopting preferred materials. And in specific, we're looking at our mission in terms of our Climate Plus goal, and that is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 45% at the raw material production level of the supply chain by 2030. And we're doing that through different tools and resources that we provide to the industry. And that's, I felt like a good reason to start with a reminder of our Climate Plus goal and the fact that we are bringing that goal and how we drive change related to that 45% reduction through the tools that we provide, and in particular to talk to you about what we're doing in standards and the Unified Standard as a direct connection to our Climate Plus goal. And part of that means it takes a team. So in terms of just managing what we have, the current suite of standards that we have, and where we're taking those in the future and looking at how we can meaningfully incorporate our Climate Plus goal. It requires people working from different parts of the world on different aspects of how we manage our standards, how we ensure the integrity of how the standards are implemented by different participants around the world with different operations, how that process is evaluated by an independent set of certification bodies and their trained auditors. So we have a standards and assurance team that is working on that development process. What is the standard and set of criteria that we provide for the industry? Running an international working group in terms of needing to have an open stakeholder process that is transparent and pulls from different types of interest groups, whether it's coming from industry, from producers, as well as from civil society members, getting that well-rounded input into how we develop our standards. And then, of course, needing ourselves to have that technical expertise, that practical knowledge of what it means to implement the standards on the ground. And in providing supportive information, there are always different scenarios that come up, different questions where we need to look at what was our intention with the standard, how do we interpret it in this particular case, and then providing that information back out to the standards users. And that also means that there needs to be a set of policies and procedures that we're providing to the certification bodies, and that we're working with them in a way that information is clear and understandable, and that they're calibrated in terms of how the different organizations that are out doing the auditing are interpreting the standards and implementing that on the ground. So that's a lot of the core work we have in our standards and assurance team. We're also responsible for the claims and labeling. So providing the logo and the labels and the language that comes to the marketplace about certification and certified products. And then, of course, helping the entire community of stakeholders that have interest in our system, that are participating, whether certified or engaging through other forms of feedback and questions. We have our stakeholder outreach as well. And then we are continuing to grow and develop our capacity based on the scale that we've reached. We need to make sure we have consistent training that we're providing to the certification bodies. And of course, where we're going with the Climate Plus goal, we need to be very clear about what we consider to be the relevant impact data that we're collecting, and putting that into a program of monitoring and evaluation to learn from as we move forward. And then, just in case you didn't catch it, this map is where the different team members running all of those activities that I just summarized, where we're based around the world. Since I was talking about the team and the scale that we've reached and the growth that we've needed to invest in to handle that capacity, I think it's interesting to look at the numbers that we've have in terms of the number of certified sites participating across all of the standards that we have today. And that also seeing the growth trajectory that we've had by and large, where we see significant growth, it's been related to participation in our recycled material standards, and in particular, the global recycled standard. That standard is unique in that it includes key impact areas such as human rights and chemical use. So it's looking broader than chain of custody at how the material is handled in the different companies that are involved in certification. And that relates to where we're going with the unified standard in terms of looking at key impact areas where we feel that it's vital to have criteria that are part of the standard. So that'll be a big part of what I talk about. But the other thing that I think is interesting for people to see with the numbers here is the reach that we have in the textile industry through our standards. This is significant engagement and participation, and it provides it provides us with a reason that we need to take a look at how we're providing standards out to the industry, And are there areas where we can gain efficiency in terms of how the whole system is managed, whether managed by ourselves or by all of you who are participating? But it also means that we have an opportunity for the impact that we intend to have on the ground through the Climate Plus goal. So we're reaching a lot of different organizations, and bringing our Climate Plus goal through standards means we have a significant way to drive impact through that certification process. So that brings me to give the background information on what we are doing with the Unified Standard. And I will say that some of the content here, if you've listened to other presentations, there is some overlap, but because I typically deliver my presentations ad lib, that means I will always say something new. So definitely pay attention, because there will be new information, and I know that I'll end up saying something that you haven't heard before anyway. But something I did want to start off with right off the bat, the asterisk here with Unified Standard. We've mentioned this before, but I just think it's really important to emphasize that that is a holding name that we have for what we're doing to bring our different standards together under one system. Behind the scenes, we have been working on a new name for the standard, as well as a new logo that will represent the standard, and then what that means for the label mock-up that we provide to the community to use in the marketplace, and the type of claims language that can be used. So that is information that we're not going to go into in detail today. We're also not going to be talking about the name of the standard until the end of the year, but I just want people to understand that it is not in the future, when finalized, going to be called the Unified Standard. What we're doing with the Unified Standard System is achieving two key objectives at the highest level. And so the first, I've talked about this a bit, where we have several different standards for different materials, and I will show that on the next slide. But because we are managing 8 different standards, it's important as we move forward with the number of participants in certification, the number of certification bodies, and therefore auditors that we're working with, we really stand to have improvement and efficiency by bringing those different standards under one harmonized system. And that's something that we identified a few years ago and started looking at how we can do this. During that same time period, organizationally, we've shifted on our Climate Plus goal in terms of our long-term strategy looking towards 2030, like what I had mentioned about our 45% reduction in emissions target that we have. So we have an opportunity through our standards and the number of participants in certification to look at how can we embed different criteria and practices and impact data into our standards related to achieving the Climate Plus goal, and using standards as a mechanism to monitor progress. So those are the two key reasons that we are moving to a unified standard system, and one of those you can very clearly see here. So this is a graphic that we've used previously to illustrate the 8 different standards that we have. So along the bottom of the screen, you can see those 8 different standards. 7 of them are material specific, and each has been developed within its own time frame and set of objectives at that time that we were addressing a particular niche and need in the industry. So there are definitely areas that overlap between the standards, but then there are also areas that are quite distinct, and therefore it can be a challenge for different participants to understand the differences between those, because a lot of companies are certified for more than one of the standards, using more than one type of material input. And then you can see that each has its own set of attributes that are included, whether it's strictly a chain of custody standard to track the claim and the material through the supply chain, or whether it includes other areas that are evaluated. So this is to illustrate why we, on one hand, determined the importance of bringing these together under one harmonized system. So that's the current state. And then where we're going, the future state of our standards is looking at a more traditional model where we separate what are the raw material practices. So within the textile industry, we also refer to that as Tier 4. It has to do with management of the raw material on the ground, essentially, as well as the first stage of production, where we're taking that raw material into its raw fiber state. And so the unified standard that you see on the left is that system that takes all of the different fibers and materials that we're working in, including some that are new for the unified standard, and addressing the Climate Plus goal that we have and other key impact areas through impact related criteria. So that's the core of what we have been working on. The core message that we're bringing in this webinar, and information coming soon in terms of where we are and what's coming next. But it also is important to make sure everybody remembers that, of course, we do have the content claim standard. That is our chain of custody standard. So when you have a particular raw material that is entering the supply chain and going through all of the different stages of manufacturing and production and distribution, all of the different companies that are involved in those parts of tiers 1 through 3 in the supply chain are required to have a CCS certification in terms of being able to track that material, the requirements around the tracking and handling and reconciling the volume of that material in order to have the ability to make claims at the end of the supply chain for the final products. So we continue, of course, to have the CCS, the content claim standard today, and it will exist in the future to support what we're doing with the unified standard for raw material as it enters the supply chain. And this is just providing another visual. So in terms of being clear about what the unified standard, the part of the supply chain that we're developing those impact criteria, there's then examples in these boxes of what that includes. The reason that it is going into first production, so right here, we've been calling this just another holding name that we have, Tier 3.5. Our 45% greenhouse gas reduction goal talks about the raw material and production. And that's why we've aligned the scope of the unified standard with that part of the supply chain. So even going from that raw material on the ground at the producer level into its first stage of production, and understanding what are the relevant impact criteria related to Climate Plus and other impact areas that we consider essential in the standard apply at those parts of the supply chain and production. And then the content claim is for the rest of the supply chain as shown here. So now I want to make sure everybody is aware of the fibers and materials that we have been developing. They're in different stages of where we've looked at criteria and what will be out for consultation soon. But it's good to get a complete picture here and to talk about a couple different things. So we have all of the major material categories represented for the intended scope of the unified standard, but how we are working in those different materials at the raw material level, it may be different. So in some cases, we will have the Tier 4 raw material level criteria and standard just as we do today, for example, with what we're doing with animal fibers and down, and to some extent with the recycled standards. Some of the new materials that we're introducing, there are already raw material level standards that have goals and objectives around responsible practices and driving impact on the ground. So it does not make sense for us to then come in and duplicate what already exists, where there are already organizations at that part of the supply chain that are participating in those certification programs. But in many of those cases, they may or may not be related to that material going into the textile industry. So for example, when we're looking at man-made cellulosics and latex, and when they're coming from virgin timber raw materials, the forest management practices, there are standards that exist in that area. Typically, those materials are going into other industries that are not necessarily the textile industry. And so we want to make sure that we provide that continuity through textile exchange standards for the rest of the supply chain, where that's relevant for organizations that are participating in our standards. But we'll be looking at a way that we can recognize those certified inputs into our system. And so that's the reason here why there's the asterisk in terms of the potential material candidates that we're looking at recognizing other standards and programs that already exist in the industry. I'm not going to talk through all of these. It's I think you all can see what's included here and can definitely ask us more questions about what we're doing and where we are with those different materials. The other thing that I wanted to highlight in terms of recognition is this particular slide is focused on the fibers and materials, but we have other concept areas that are being developed in the standard that we're looking at the potential for recognition of evaluation of those areas. So for example, that would be human rights and livelihoods, as well as chemical use in some of those environmental areas at the facility level. And I just realized that I did not put the asterisk at biomaterials. That should be also tagged as a candidate for potential recognition of pre-existing raw material standards. So the last bit that I will talk about is the pivot that we have in the unified standard system for driving outcomes. So traditionally, sustainability standards were developed on more of a practice-based model, and that's where there's a process to go through and identify what are the best practices. How do you write criteria that are evaluated for organizations against whether they're implementing those practices or not, and then what happens when they're not being implemented. That's the traditional model that's been used for a lot of the sustainability standards. And many of those standards organizations are taking a similar pivot in terms of, now that we've learned from what we've developed, how do we move into the future in terms of really driving lasting impact and desired outcomes in terms of the change that we want to see on the ground. And that is part of our vision for the unified standard in terms of introducing a hybrid standard model where we will have that traditional practice-based set of criteria, but also commingled with where we intend to drive outcomes and look at how we can measure progress towards change on the ground. And part of that, so it is a shift, that's a shift in terms of what we're looking at in our standards, as well as what we're doing at the raw material producer level for the climate plus impact areas. So we understand that where we're going with our standards in the future represents a certain amount of change to the industry and to the participants in our certification. We want to make sure that we don't introduce something that sets the bar so high that suddenly there are a lot of well-intended participants out there that certification is no longer accessible to them. So we're looking at how we can create this hybrid standard model in a way that ensures participation is accessible and that we put organizations on the right trajectory where they can see what they're doing today and where they need to go in the future. So being creative with how the criteria and other content of the standard provides that clear pathway for participants in certification. And part of that is that we need to look at how we what is the impact data related to outcomes that needs to be collected as part of the certification process, get that in for baseline information, and roll that into the monitoring and evaluation so we can start to learn from that data and help guide where the standard moves in the future. But another part of that is, in the standard from day one, from version 1, being clear about where continuous improvement is needed by the participants. And that is something I'll show in a couple of slides of how we're introducing continuous improvement into the standard. But in terms of when I keep talking about the Climate Plus and other key impact areas and how we're using that information related to our Climate Plus goal into development of the standard, this is a visual to show how it's all coming together. So the tiles along the top of the screen are the key impact areas where we've been specifically looking at what are the practices and outcomes that need to be part of the standard content, and going through a process with our Climate Plus team and our content experts that we have organizationally, as well as reviewing externally with experts and our international working group, going through that process to identify what are the long-term impacts that we want to see on the ground, and sort of working backwards from that in terms of what are the outcomes and the indicators of success for that Climate Plus goal and the impact areas that you see along the top of the screen. So that was a process that we went through during a lot of 2022 to get to those impacts and outcomes. And then we took that information to look at what does that mean for practices that need to be seen on the ground. And then from those practices, how does that relate into an actual standard and the criteria that is being drafted? And that's where we're taking that hard look at, rather than taking best practices and just translating them right into what would be evaluated for conformance, and only introducing a standard that kind of represents the left side of the screen here. We've looked at opportunities where we can incorporate other types of criteria that ensure the standard is accessible and is getting people on the right trajectory. So the last bit that I'll mention before handing over to Trini is what those criteria and indicators look like. So what the broader community will be seeing soon is where we've taken those the key impact areas and put them into draft conformance related criteria. So those are the traditional type of criteria evaluated for making a certification decision about a particular organization. Then leadership criteria are ones that are not specifically evaluated for certification, but they identify practices that are going above and beyond what we consider to be necessary in version 1. And therefore, the organization, when they're meeting the leadership criteria, they're demonstrating that they're showing leadership in that particular area. The other intention with the leadership criteria is that they're giving an indication of where we want to see practices evolve over time. And most leadership criteria at some point will become conformance-related criteria in future versions of the standard. And then the last bit is that in order for this all to tie together and know are the criteria that we've developed, are the practices being implemented actually driving the change that we want to see related to Climate Plus and other impact areas? And that will be through impact indicators that we're defining as those measurements and other information that we want to collect in the field to be able to evaluate over time, learn from, and improve the standard and provide feedback to the participants. And with that, I'm going to hand over to you, Trini.
Wonderful. Thank you, Laura. And hi, everyone. This is Trini speaking. So in the next couple of slides, I'm going to run you through a little bit more of the scope, as well as an overview of timeline. So in terms of scope, and I'll map that out on a timeline chart as well, but we will be having 2 public consultations, and we will be releasing the Unified Standard System for public comment in stages. So the first draft, which we estimate to release in May, will contain elements of the bigger picture, but not 100% of it. It will definitely contain the system that Laura had just explained, the conformance criteria, leadership criteria, that system it will include. And then it will also include the sections of organizational management, land use criteria, animal welfare, human rights and livelihoods, facility and environmental criteria. And we will also provide supplemental information on how to read the Unified Standard and a little bit more about the fiber types. So there will also be additional summaries that will be released that Callie will also explain a little bit more about. Then the second draft is estimated to go live in September of this year. It will basically be the entire content of the first draft, plus the feedback that we have heard during the first public consultation, so elaborated on. And the second draft then will also include some newer elements that will not be in the first draft, which are more elaboration on related policies, on impact indicators, the supplemental requirements around chain of custody, the use of our trademark and group certification, as well as more information on the supply chain modules on tiers 1, 2, and 3. Laura also mentioned the recognition part earlier, which is also something that we estimate making live in the second draft. But the key takeaway here is that there will be a release in stages, and there will be multiple opportunities to weigh in. The big first one will be around May 2023 in the first draft release, and the second one will be in September for the second draft release. Then when we look more around the timeline of what our, or if you go to the next slide, next steps will be between release of the first draft to the end of this year. In May, we will make that first draft live for public consultation, which will show the criteria that I had just shown. And then in between May and September, we will seek a lot of feedback, have conversations, and also continue drafting towards the draft 2 release. So there are a lot of overlaying steps of gathering feedback, weaving those in, but also making progress on those areas that we have targeted for draft 2 release, while including the feedback that we have heard on elements of draft 1. And then September 2023, middle of the screen here, we will make the second draft live, which will be a full presentation of the draft content that we plan on making live. And that will also be the final consultation to weigh in on a more complete picture of the Unified Standard System. Then in October 2023, we are holding our annual conference, which will be in London, United Kingdom this year. And during that time, we also plan on holding a lot more informational sessions and feedback gathering sessions on the Unified Standard System. So the second public consultation will likely run through the end of our conference at the end of October. And then December this year is when we estimate to finalize the version 1 of the Unified Standard, including the recognition program and all these draft 2 elements that I had shown before. That is also when we plan on giving an update on the standard name and finalizing the standard name, and having the full framework of claims and labeling live as well. When we go to the next slide, that is now a little bit of a click out, looking from December onwards to when the standard actually will be mandatory. So 2024 is the year of implementation, preparation, while we have the standard live or plan to having it live in December 2023, 2024 will be the time when we are getting our full systems updates in gear, work with our certification partners on training on the new standard and providing all the supplemental documents that go along a standards release. 2025 is the year where the standard is effective, and effective means that auditing may begin by approved certification partners. And that is the year where there would be a system where the old standard may still be used, but also the new standard may be used. So it is not mandatory yet, but it is the first time when the new standard can be used. We will also, during that year, begin collecting baseline data and also put all the gears in motion towards the mandatory date, which will be 2026. So mandatory date in 2026 means that from that point on, that will be further specified, the old standard system can no longer be used, and our existing certified sites will have to comply with the new standard, but also interested parties that want to certify to our standard will be using the unified standard at the time. So the auditing and the certification will then only be geared towards the unified standard system. And then the last slide that I want to show before handing it over to Callie is the standards architecture as it currently is. So we will have, when we release it in May, you will be looking at approximately 6 main sections of the standard, which are organizational management, human rights and livelihoods, land use, animal welfare, facility and environmental, and supplemental requirements. And then we've listed out here kind of the more reference points of what the subsections will be. But these are the key sections that you will find that will also consolidate and harmonize our existing standards into the new sections. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Callie, to talk more about participation.
Thank you. We can jump into the first slide. I think most people on the call, I was going through the attendees list. I think I've talked to most everybody. I lead the standards engagement work where we're really the people in the inbox. People know us for asking questions and helping provide guidance and offering trainings for certain aspects of the standard, but we also advise or strategize with the standards team on the best way to launch material into the world. So when we're updating policy, when we're releasing new user manuals or guidance, our team works on making sure that it's readable and digestible for the industry. And so naturally with this unified standards work, there's a lot of technical development work that Laura, Trini, and the rest of the standards team are work planning. And then our job with standards engagement is to kind of create an overlay of what is the engagement and communication plan that will complement and support the launch of all of this work that they're doing. So our work plan for the year is really underpinned by the standards unified standard work plan. And so you can see that complementing each of the dates and draft publications, our team is also working on various sections of how we can make sure that the information that is coming out will be really easy to understand and access, and that stakeholders feel like they're being brought along on the journey. And so it's not a confusing process to open this master document and try to make sense of it through the lens of your industry or your sector that you participate in. So I'll get into what each of these periods mean, but after we launch the first draft in May, we kind of enter a rinse and repeat mode where we're publishing drafts, collecting feedback, publishing drafts and collecting feedback. And then as Trini mentioned, when we have the standard published in 2024, but not yet ready to be audited against, it's really a good time for our team with stakeholder engagement to help stakeholders prepare for what it might look like to change their system over either as a producer, a processor, or a brand, and retailers who are also selling the product. So we can go to the next slide and I'll talk a little bit about the phase that we're in now. January of this year until May, and I say ish because it will really go beyond, we're building a lot of new content, educating the industry on the current standard system, and then refreshing some of our externally facing resources. So in the build phase, a lot of this language that we're talking about and a lot of these concepts that we're presenting are a relatively new way to talk about our standard system. Previously, we had very siloed communication. We talked about each standard as its own separate entity and its own separate impact and effect that it was having at the raw materials stage. And so we're bringing this all under one roof, not only in a physical document, but also in the way that we talk about our standard system. So this has been a long process to figure out exactly how we want to frame and build content around this new way of talking about the system that we're building. So an example is going from talking about GRS and RCS to now calling it a material category, such as recycled in the new standard system. I'll talk through the summary papers that we'll be offering that will help explain this new framing in a moment. And then also the education piece. So I think when we are looking at the scope and the reach of the unified standard system, we're not just revising and publishing one individual standard, we're really touching every single sector that the standard covers all at once. And there's different levels of involvement that our stakeholders have had in standards in the past. So for example, animal fibers and materials have been quite involved, both in our roundtable and in the standard system. It's a lot of overlap in stakeholders. So there's been more of a level of understanding as to how the standards work, versus the MMCF stakeholders or some of the recycled stakeholders have not been really brought into the standards engagement in the past. And so we're doing a lot of engagement in their spaces so that we can help provide a better idea of what the standard system looks like for them. And so when we launch this new model, they're able to engage in a more easily to understand way. We'll be hosting a series of webinars, obviously this webinar, and then when we launch the drafts in May and September, we'll also be having some sessions on this at conference in October. And then just starting to update the way that we speak about the standard system in the ongoing inquiries like the hub and on calls and in the inbox. We'll be doing a refresh of the website. So we're working with our comms team to make sure that the way that we're organizing things like just our menu options or every single standards page right now talks about the standards in an individualized way. So we're working on a refresh to make sure that as we start to launch this document publicly, that the language that we're using online also follows. I think that's it for this slide. We can go to the next one. So Trini mentioned this distinction between trying to present information in a way that makes sense, but also still solicit feedback throughout the process. So we're breaking this up into two papers, summary paper and a discussion paper. And a summary paper informs the industry. It's a paper that we're writing to make sure that each sector or each material category can really understand the draft and know what to look for when they open the document. So they'll be very customized to an animal fiber material audience or a recycled audience, or we're even breaking it up by sectors. If you're a brand or a retailer opening the document, you'll be able to see exactly what you're looking for and parsing through the unified standard master document. So this is going to be published to a wide audience. We'll post these on our website. We'll make sure that they're going out in newsletters and kind of taking them on the road to different events that we go to so that everybody from their lens can understand what we're talking about when we publish the document. And then a discussion paper is a paper that frames up discussion points around specific topics and questions that kind of remain to be answered within the standard system. So we're really soliciting feedback on certain topics that we're still considering internally. And we'd really like for these types of papers to go to a targeted audience so that people who have relevant backgrounds or experiences in that really niche concept or idea can provide us relevant feedback on that area. So discussion papers will be I would say, a narrower audience that they're going out to, and we're looking for feedback on particular areas. Not to say that anybody from the entire supply chain or any stakeholder can't provide feedback on any part of the unified standard document, but the discussion papers are just meant to solicit ideas around thoughts that we're still looking to collect feedback on. And if you go to the next slide, I can talk through what will go in a summary paper. So like I said, we have a number of different ways that we're kind of breaking up what we imagine people and the lenses that they'll be coming to the unified standard document with. So it'll be animal materials, fiber crops, recycled materials, brands and retailers, processors, and then civil society and NGO. So however you identify within one of those categories, you can click really easily on a summary paper and get a rundown as to everything you should be looking for. I have some information on the contents on the right-hand side, and then changes per category will be based on whatever lens you're looking at. So obviously, if you're reading the animal materials summary paper, it will show you animal welfare concepts that you should be looking for that might be new or have shifted. But we're not going to include the animal welfare section in the recycled summary paper because it's not relevant to that audience to know what's being updated in that section. Obviously, they can click on the animal materials one if they're interested, but it's just a way for us to be able to frame up what we think is important for each of the people coming to, each of the audience members coming to this reading for the first time. And if we go to the next slide, this is just a little bit about how we're going to promote and collect feedback once we launch the drafts. So we have a number of engagement touch points that we work with within the Textile Exchange Network. Our website, our newsletters, we host webinars, and we would really encourage everybody to help us spread the word when we do publish things like this. I know that our reach is only as far as our mailing list goes, and so we're going to try to really broaden out that involvement so people don't feel like something was happening that they missed, or that this massive or a shift in the standard system has happened without them being aware of what's going on. So a way that we're doing that is through events this year. We have a number of staff members going to different events all around the world throughout the rest of the year. And so we're going to try to put this content in the hands of various staff members so that if there is an in-person engagement opportunity, that there's this information available. And then the collection of feedback, we're still, we're still kind of sussing out the way that we're going to be collecting feedback through various tools assessment, but there'll be really clear information in the summary papers as to how you can participate and give your opinion on the different criterion. We can go to the next. So here's just a bunch of different ways to stay engaged and updated on the process. This presentation will go out afterwards, so feel free to click on any of these links to make sure that you're signed up to our newsletters, that you're participating in the Hub community. And if you have any questions, you can always email us, standards@. If you go to the next slide, I believe I have just another main slide with standards@textileexchange.org. Myself and my colleague Claudio, who is new to the team as of January, but really going to take the lead on a lot of the unified standards engagement, are always available here. And then I think that's it for me. So we'll move over to question and answer. And I know that we have a couple that we could get started with. And if anybody else has questions, feel free to keep typing them in the chat about any part of the presentation or something that we might not have covered. So I think I'll start. I think this question would be for you, Laura. Can you talk a little bit more about the impact data? Somebody's asking, will this new standard give us primary impact data?
Realize I need to unmute myself. So that is the plan. So right now, what you'll see in the first draft is going to focus on the criteria. And then in the meantime, we're still working on impact data, but that will be part of the second draft consultation. So, we're looking at it in terms of what are the most meaningful points of data that we need to collect, because obviously it doesn't make sense that we're going to collect everything. That would then introduce a whole other time frame to how an audit is conducted and kind of the impact on the participants. So we're going to be really targeted about what we think is the most meaningful type of data to collect to be able to monitor that impact. And that will be transparent. It'll be information that we share.
And I think just to add on to that, think this person is coming at it from the brand perspective as well. So I guess maybe could you touch on the long-term vision of what the impact data will tell us in the industry?
So our Climate Plus team is overall responsible in terms of how we're taking the Climate Plus goal we have and understanding the type of impact data that's needed to report on that goal and the progress being made on that goal. And it will pull from not only participation in standards, but from other areas that, for example, like aggregate type data coming from different regions for different types of production on the ground. And that will be rolled into a system to communicate back out to the broader community. Hopefully that's helpful for now. Since I'm not responsible for that area, I probably won't have very many more details.
Oh, that's great. Okay, so going a little bit deeper into the actual structure of the standard. So I think in the beginning of the presentation, you just talked about what overarchingly what buckets the standard will cover. And so this person's wondering, when the standards are unified, will each scope, I think is what they mean, include social, environmental, chemical processing requirements that are currently only in the GRS right now, or I guess you could say like land management exists in animal welfare. Will this be across all of the standards now is the idea?
Yes, that is correct. And of course, in some cases, there will be impact criteria that are not relevant to certain materials. So it's going to be where it's relevant. The standard and the way that you'll see it in the draft is set up to identify which, for each and every criterion, which are the materials that it's applicable to. So you'll be able to go through and see, okay, is this only applicable to certain animal fibers or to recycled or all? We'll have a category that, this particular criterion is applicable to all of the fibers and materials. And that is something about like part of bringing this under a unified standard system, and what Trini showed when we had the slide that provided the sections and the subsections. Those are intended to be where we have cross-cutting criteria developed, and then being able to do that click down to make sure, is it applicable to everything or to this one particular type of material.
Great. So we have a question going into the supply chain module. So I think it was noted that the work that we're doing really applies to tier 4 and 3.5. And so the supply chain modules 1 through 3 are being considered, but this person's wondering specifically about waste collectors and sorters, which would apply to the recycled materials category. So they say usually tier 6, will that be in scope of the unified standard?
So we are not going to have certification of individuals or organizations in that part of the supply chain. It will be very similar to how it is set up right now for the GRS, with how the source of the reclaimed material is evaluated to ensure that it is meeting our definitions for what's accepted for recycled materials. Then from a human rights and livelihoods perspective, you will see draft criteria that relate to additional due diligence that we are through the draft expecting that the organizations that are sourcing from those type of providers, what type of additional due diligence they'll do from a human rights perspective. So right now that's what we have drafted and you'll see, but and have that available for commenting on, but we won't expect auditors from certification bodies to go into that part of the supply chain and conduct any sort of evaluation.
Great. The next question I can take, it's just about the drafts being shared publicly or if they need to register somewhere. So they'll be shared publicly and be published on the website. So we have a standards page, that's standards transition, that you can go to, that will be updated when we do publish the drafts, so that you can click on each summary paper and the master version of the unified standard document. And then additionally, if you wanted to have it come into your inbox or your daily digest, you should register with those links that are in the resource page, I think a couple slides before, so that you can be engaged in the standard stakeholder hub community, and also on our mailing list. If you're receiving our monthly newsletter from Textile Exchange, we'll definitely post it in there. So You can come to the website to look for it, or if you want to get signed up in our different engagement platforms, it'll come to you. Another question that's, I think, a little bit more broad and about the development process of the approach. How is the proposed green claims directive impacting our approach to this unified standard development process?
So I wasn't sure if I was going to answer that or Trini, but I'm happy to provide information that I have related to the background work that we're doing on looking at the new name for the standard, the applicable logo. It includes the relevant claims. So obviously the scope of the unified standard, it will include a lot of a similar scope that we have today, but it's going to be expanding into new areas. And so we need to look at the claims as they relate to the new areas that we're going into, whether that's new materials, but also into new types of impact that we're driving through the criteria. And part of that also means that we're looking at pending legislation that's happening and other guidelines. It's a very active area currently. I'm sure many of you are aware of that. And so we want to make sure that we're looking at claims for the future that are going to be in alignment with where legislation and other guidelines are moving as well. And so it's a fairly extensive process that we're going through. We will be sharing that information towards the end of the year, and then also rolling the claims and labeling into a pilot program for 2024 so that we can make sure we're testing the logic behind what we develop.
Great. That is everything that has come in on the back end here. If there are any further questions, we'll be posting whatever we did receive in the standard stakeholder hub community so that we can refer back to it. And this recording will go out to all who registered. So if anything else comes up in the meantime, you know where to find us. And I think with that, if you have anything else to add, Laura.
Nope. So just stay tuned for what's coming next during May with the first draft. And we really appreciate everybody's attention to what we're doing and getting us feedback.
Thank you to our speakers, and thank you for participating in today's webinar. Again, as a friendly reminder, the recording will be posted on the hub and an email will be sent to all registered participants with a link to today's presentation. Also, be sure to join us on the hub to continue conversation and asking of questions and engaging with one another. That concludes our webinar. Thank you. Goodbye.